start. Good morning, welcome, and thank you for coming along to the release of the authorities' second major report after the RET report of some 18 months or so ago. The report is pretty weighty, as you've seen, and I imagine that most of you haven't had much of a chance to do more than flick through it if you've been able to do that. But the report does have a very helpful summary up front, and the press release that's been circulated captures some of the main thrusts of the report, so they might be useful starting areas. The report and its recommendations are driven very much by the climate science. That's the accumulating evidence that the planet is warming up gradually, and that's likely to go on doing that over the decades ahead with some quite unwelcome consequences unless Australia and other countries get more serious and get involved in more concerted action to do something about the root cause of that problem, which is the increasing emissions of greenhouse gases. So the report, as I say, is very much driven by the climate science, and I'll come back to the climate science later on. The main recommendation in the report is that the government should target a minimum reduction of 15% in Australia's greenhouse gas emissions compared with the 2000 levels by 2020. Now that represents quite a step up on the current commitment to a minimum reduction of 5% by 2020, quite a step up. But it's not without some costs, but we believe it's doable and it's there to be done, really. There are other recommendations in the report, and we believe that the recommendation I've just mentioned, taken together with those other recommendations for sustained ongoing action, would add up to quite a credible package and would represent a credible start by Australia in making its reasonable contribution to the global endeavour that's required in this area. So it's a step up, but it's doable, and taken with all the other things that we're proposing, we think we've got a credible package there that, if implemented, would make a useful, a fair contribution by Australia to this global endeavour that's required. I mentioned that the science, the climate science is what's driving this report in large part, and we're lucky in having some members of the authority here who are very much in the midst of all that science material, and they'll be happy to able to answer questions and talk some more about that later on. But for non-science, for me as a non-scientist, the climate science means this accumulation of evidence about those things that I mentioned, the planet warming up and so on, that's come from the rigorous processes that scientists go through and the careful way they write up their results in their search for the truth. They write up their results in ways that, to me as a layman, described in some cases as truths, in other cases as provisional truths, and have things like probabilities and other qualifications around them. So that, to me, and it's that kind of climate science, that's what I mean when I talk about or interpret climate science. And these days we hear more and more, I think, that people are saying that they believe in the climate science. But I suspect that these beliefs, like modern beer, modern views really come in different strengths. We've all heard people say, yeah, maybe something is happening out there and maybe we should be doing something more about it. But this is not the kind of belief that one would have if one truly believed in the climate science and what it's telling us. People who have a strong belief in the science really want that belief to be followed through with effective, credible action. And there is a gap, I think, between those two particular strengths. I suspect also that there are lots of people in Australia who are in the first category, the weak belief category, if you like, who are still not entirely persuaded, motivated to move into the stronger category, and there are lots of possible reasons for that. Just to mention a couple of them, and they have to do with, I think, is the almost uniqueness of the global warming challenge and the policy measures required to deal with that challenge. One is the time dimension of the global warming challenge. If there's a problem in the economy, for example, you can see it coming pretty quickly. Unemployment will rise or inflation will rise, and there'll be a toolkit of proven, known measures, accepted measures that can be turned on and off to deal with that problem, and then it will disappear, at least for a time. But the situation is very different with climate change. It's something that occurs over long periods of time. It takes decades for trends to emerge, to become measurable and to become concerns, and there can sometimes be pauses in those trends. So it's a very different ballgame compared to the usual kinds of challenges in this time dimension that policymakers have to contend with. And that sort of helps put all the focus really on the short term. Politicians are naturally disposed towards short-term issues and problems, conflicts and so on, and they're encouraged in this regard, of course, by business groups and by lobbyists and so on. So it's not unnatural that these shorter-term issues and the focus on them sometimes trumps, and quite often trumps, the longer-term issues, even though they can still be very important issues. And again, there's no kind of policy toolkit of proven measures that one can turn to introduce to do something effective about this longer-term challenge. So this time dimension, I think, is pretty important, and we do say quite a lot in the report about it. We talk about the need to get effective action underway and to sustain that effective action. We talk about the need to do as much as possible up front to make the task down the track more manageable. And we talk about the trade-offs that exist between dealing with things effectively early on and delaying, putting off more effective action until down the track, and the consequences for the cost of adjustment of those different trade-offs, and also for where the burden falls between current and future generations. So that time dimension is a distinguishing feature of the climate change problem and the policies required to deal with it. I think another dimension that also distinguishes climate change is its global dimension. Global warming is obviously a global phenomenon and requiring concerted global action. That really goes without saying. And I think this global nature of the problem also tends to diffuse the focus from global warming to other more immediate problems. And this is particularly so when, as in the countries around the world, there are some, as there are some groups in Australia, who are not entirely convinced that there is a problem out there and that they should be eagerly, effectively pursuing action at this time. So that's another sort of reason for delaying or holding back this migration of people who have a weak belief in climate change to perhaps developing and exhibiting a stronger belief in climate change and the need for it. The other aspect of the global dimension, of course, is that I think it requires a more cooperative brand of diplomacy in international negotiations than our policymakers are traditionally involved in, namely the sort of competitive, combative nature of negotiating a thing like a trade agreement, for example, or multilateral trade agreements, even more so, where to the extent possible you try to do the other side in the eye if you can. So that kind of diplomacy, I think, needs to be modified when one is talking about trying to get the globe on, get countries generally on a course that will deal effectively with this longer-term global problem. And again, in our report, we talk a lot about the global dimension of the problem. We talk in some detail about what other countries are doing and proposing to do. And we also make reference to some of the significant international forums that are getting together over the next couple of years, where Australia will be expected to play a serious role and to indicate some hopefully significant contributions that Australia will be making to this global endeavour. So that's about all I really wanted to say. I think that there are lots of issues in the report that anyone who is really interested in getting a better understanding of them could do a lot worse than spend a bit of time on the report. I think you'll find it quite readable, informative, and hopefully persuasive as well. That's all I really wanted to say by way of introductory comments. We're fortunate in having several members of the authority with us today, as well as the CEO, Anthea Harris, and some of her people here. So, I feel very confident that we're well placed to answer almost any kind of question you'd like to throw this way. And the meeting is really now open for questions, and in responding to some questions there might also be an opportunity on the part of some of the members to add a bit here and there to the brief comments that I've made. So, any questions or comments on what you've been able to?
Given the government's intention to abolish the CCA, do you have strong hopes that your recommendations in this report will actually be listened to and taken into account in the policy development process?
We're hopeful. We're always hopeful. Otherwise we wouldn't be here, I think. But we'll just have to see where it all pans out. But, I talked earlier on about the time dimension in the report and so on. There's also a time dimension in when governments act, and if the present government is not disposed to act as fulsomely as we might have hoped on the basis of these recommendations, the report and the arguments underlying the recommendations are out there, and people will have a chance, if they're so desire, to pursue those and to make a judgment on their appropriateness. And in time it's going to be, I think, that public knowledge and consensus of some emergence of some consensus that things have to be done that might down the track, if not immediately, lead to the sorts of actions that we're recommending now.
Does the report go through what sort of carbon price you would need to achieve the reductions that you're recommending? And alternatively, given that the alternative policy is to fund it out of the budget, does it have any any numbers on what would be required out of the budget to meet the targets?
Yes, it does, and I think Anthea Harris is well placed to respond to those questions.
Yes, certainly. The report does go through some modelling estimates that were prepared for us by the Treasury and the former Innovation Department. So that modelling was undertaken using the current legislative provisions in place, so with the carbon price arrangements in place. And we don't pretend to know what the carbon price would have been, so it goes through a number of scenarios, a no price, a low price, a medium and a high price scenarios to see what sort of patterns might emerge, what might be estimated to emerge in terms of emission reductions across different sectors and for the economy as a whole. So that material is presented. Now, of course, the government has a different policy in mind. It's going to be implementing its direct action policy. So what we have said in the report is that we hope that this is still useful information. So we present information about the sorts of opportunities. The opportunities are the same opportunities no matter what policies you have in place, and what kinds of carbon prices or the magnitude of the incentive otherwise provided that might be required to elicit those opportunities. So that's certainly, we've got lots of material in this report, and there's also a separate modelling report on our website from the Treasury and the former Innovation Department.
Is it fair to say that the cheapest option for reaching the target, the 15% target that you've got here, is actually to purchase international permits entirely, and that you'd be able to meet the target via a fund purchasing such permits? Was $210 million?
Basically, that's right. The cost of the incremental cost, there are some domestic actions that will result in some mitigation domestically of greenhouse gas emissions, but not nearly enough to get to the minimum 20% target that we talked about in the short term, because we're not even at the 2020, the 2000 levels at the moment. We're above that, so we have to come down. And given the time that it takes to design and implement measures to reduce domestic emissions, and the time it takes before the results of those policies start to show up in reduced emissions, to get to the 20%, the minimum 15% reduction by 2020, the purchase of permits, international permits, is really the only way of getting there, and that can be done very cost effectively. It can be done very effectively because there are genuine international reductions out there that can be purchased at historically low prices. The costs of the permits that we talk about in the report are currently under $1 per unit. We've talked about a budgetary cost, a direct budgetary cost of getting to the minimum 15%, the minimum 19% through the purchase of international permits, costing something like $200 million to $850 million, depending upon the price. 200 if we assume a price of $1.50, and if we assume a price of $2, it's about $840 million this cost over the period to 2020, given those assumptions about the price of the units. And as I say, the current price of the unit is below $1.
I just want to stress that the report emphasises the importance for the medium and longer term of the domestic transition in Australia's energy economy, so that whilst international purchases may supplement domestic emission reductions, the report does stress that it's important over the longer term for the Australian economy to shift to a low carbon base.
That's right, and that's a point that's well emphasised in the press release as well, I think.
Do you have a figure in there for meeting the 5% that we're heading for now? Because there's also about a $133 million gap, I think, up around 2020. That business has also talked about urged the government to set up a sovereign fund of international credit. Can you put a price on that?
Anthea?
No, we haven't put a price on that. What we have identified is a range of opportunities. We've put forward modelling estimates of the sorts of opportunities that might come forward with different sizes of different price incentives. What we have done, though, is suggested that the government might like to consider the use of international units if there is any gap between wherever domestic activities get us to and even the 5% target. So you might want to think about, certainly not rule out using international emissions reductions to help you get to the 5 as well. That's certainly not to downplay the importance of domestic emissions reductions as well, but might be a role for international emission reduction even to get to 5, and certainly for beyond 5. That certainly strikes the authority as the most sensible way at this time to achieve those stronger targets, which means stronger targets now, of course, means that you are avoiding much more rapid emissions reductions later.
We've been hit with a sort of a wave of job losses in manufacturing in recent weeks. I wonder if you could sort of talk about the trade-off between the economic and cost of going to a higher target. You know, what that would mean for manufacturing and jobs in general and things like that.
Yeah, I think Professor Quiggan might like to make a comment on that.
Yeah, well, I would be keen. The report includes estimates of the economic cost to the Australian economy of reaching both the 2020 targets and the more ambitious targets we'll need by 2050. Those numbers aren't trivial, but they are small enough to be undetectable against the background of steady improvement in living standards that we can expect from technological progress, capital investment and so forth. Now, I think if we look at recent experience, some people we had the same kind of modelling before the carbon price, some people don't like modelling. What we see, I think, confirmed the rightness of that modelling. There were hyperbolic claims about the damage that we'd done by the carbon price at the time. Of course, that was invisible. There were equally hyperbolic claims that removing the carbon price would provide huge benefits to the economy. In fact, of course, a number of these job losses in manufacturing have been announced after the announcement of legislation to remove the carbon price. I don't think there's any causal link either between the earlier closure of these ones and carbon price. It simply reflects the fact that the economic cost of these measures is tiny in comparison to things like fluctuations in the value of the dollar, general movements in the economy. And so we're seeing that although it was suggested that the carbon price was going to cripple manufacturing and that removing it would save it, we see nothing of the kind in the news today or the news we've seen over the last month or two.
In the report you talk about 15% being a credible target for Australia. Does that mean 5% isn't credible in your view? And also, if I understand it correctly, you've come up with 15% by looking at a budget globally for what would be needed to be done to keep global warming at 2%. Before the election, both of the parties had instead a set of conditions. I'm not actually sure if that still is the bipartisan arrangement, but nevertheless, can you comment first on whether 5% is or isn't credible, and second, on where Australia stands in relation to those conditions that were set out in 2009?
The conditions are a significant part of the report. They probably get more coverage in the report than they warrant, but they're there, and Anthea might like to speak about that. But on your first question, yeah, the 5% minimum, the present commitment, isn't credible in terms of the task that has to be done and the time frame to stick with the 2020 target of a minimum of 5% would, within the framework of the present global budget and Australia's share of that global budget, would impose a virtually impossible task of catching up, making up that lost ground and getting to the end result in the time available.
Just in relation to the target conditions, our understanding is that still is there is still bipartisan commitment to those target range conditions. There are 3 sets of conditions. There are conditions relating to doing more than 5%, a separate set of conditions for doing 15, and a separate set again for doing 25. We go through those in detail in our report, and our judgment is on those conditions that the conditions for moving beyond 5% have been met. Our judgment is for the 15% conditions. Some of those clearly have been met, some are marginal. for the conditions relating to the 25%, they have not been met. Of course, our legislation requires us to take a broad set of things into account, which is what we have done. They, of course, include looking at the conditions, and we have done that, but they're not the only thing that fed into our report, and as required by legislation, we're looking at a broader set of factors.
Can I just add one comment on that, please? Because I think it's really an extremely important point, this question of credibility. And if I could quote from the report, it says that the 5% target is not credible because a 5% target is inconsistent with Australia's fair contribution to the long-term global limit warming to below 2 degrees. So pursuing a 5% target by 2020 would impose an impossible burden on future generations. In other words, it would not be possible to reduce emissions fast enough subsequently in order to bring emissions in under those necessary to meet the 2-degree target. So a 5% by 2020 target effectively means relinquishing the commitment to limit warming to 2 degrees, or at least for Australia to play its fair part in limiting global warming to 2 degrees.
We've already heard from some business groups already criticising these targets, saying, you know, it will impact on the economy and living standards. I just wanted to get a taste from you guys as far as what the cost of living or the living standards or the economy, what effects there would be on them if nothing is done, if these aren't adopted.
Yes.
So Australia has a choice currently. Do they stick with the minimum 5% or do they do more than 5%? So our report's really all about the costs of doing more than the minimum. And as we suggest in our report, we say you should do more than the minimum, and that the way you should do it in the circumstances in which we find ourselves now, the best way to do that is to through the purchase of international emissions reductions to achieve the stronger target. We suggest that setting up a fund to purchase international emissions reductions is the way to do that. So in terms of the impact on living standards and impact on businesses, all of those sorts of things, you have to ask yourself, the government accepted our recommendations, set up a fund, purchased international units. What would be the flow-on effects for living standards, for business costs, all those sorts of things? Of course, we're not saying that that's costless. Of course, budgetary costs have impacts on the broader community, but we need to put things in perspective. It's not, you can't sort of draw a necessary and clear link between setting up a fund to purchase international emissions units and the death of the economy as we know it, which is what I'm sure that some of the press releases you might see today might say.
To restate a point, it'd be worth checking back what those same groups said about the introduction of the carbon price 18 months ago. I think you'll find very similar claims being made, and of course with no detectable impact. If I could comment a bit on, I don't think it's quite impossible for Australia to meet its contributions, to meet its goal, even if we fall short over the period of 2020, but it will be substantially more expensive. And so we're not even talking about future generations. If we decide to meet our commitment, we'll be paying substantially more in the next decade than we would if we started now. If we decide not to, and the rest of the world does the same, there are catastrophic consequences for Australia, for future generations that are set out in the report. There's also the gamble that we can be the international slacker, we can get away with doing nothing while other countries take up the burden. I don't know whether that's feasible or not. Those are the choices before us.
Can I just comment as well that I think your question, or a number of the questions, have been framed around the economic costs of acting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's also a very important economic cost associated with the impacts of unmitigated climate change. And that is extremely difficult to quantify, but there are many examples that we see that are described in the report of the current observed impacts of climate variations and climate change that have already been affecting Australia, and the projected increased impacts in the future associated with unmitigated climate change. And we've already seen over the last 10 years, and even in the last 12 months, increases in wildfires, increase in coastal erosion, While no scientists have yet been able to link the Queensland and New South Wales drought to climate change, because it's too recent to be able to do that, there's obviously been major investment in addressing that announced by the government yesterday. There are many, many economic costs associated with unmitigated climate change. Most, in fact, all economic assessments that I have seen indicate at least a threefold or more greater cost of unmitigated climate change than of addressing climate change.
Just to elaborate on John's observations about the economic cost, the Treasury modelling undertaken for the authority compared the economic impact of a 5% target by 2020 with the economic impact of a 19% target as recommended by the authority, and concluded that in 2020, for the 5% target, gross national income per person is expected to be $66,450, whereas under the 19% target, the gross national income per person would be $66,350. So a shortfall of $100, a difference that would be made up in the subsequent 3 months. And so it seems that $100 over a few years looks like a relatively small sacrifice for Australians to make in order for Australia to make a credible contribution to tackling global warming.
Can I ask you, in this report, or where you see the renewable energy target fitting its contribution to meeting that 15%, and also have you begun or will you begin your review, as you are required under law to begin, of the renewable energy target?
In the work that we've been done, we've assumed that the existing target arrangement, renewable energy target arrangements, would continue. They're one of the assumptions underlying the report and the recommendations there. Now, the government has chosen to conduct its own separate review, and it's entitled to do that. I don't imagine it'll be as expert or as independent as ours would have been, but that's a biased view. We really have to await and see how expert and how independent the report is when it comes out. That's the fair thing to do. As for our own activities, again, Anthea Harris is best able to indicate what we're doing here. We're not embarked upon a separate RET review. If by some chance the authority has a longer life than it appears to have, and the existing legislation remained in place, well, then that would be something to reconsider. But in the meanwhile, we do have some, and this is what Anthea can add to, we do have some expertise within the authority that could be useful in providing some inputs into the current review, and electricity is one particular thing that's being looked at. I would hope myself that the body that's been appointed by the government to conduct this review will see its way open to come and talk to Anthea and her people. Now, these people know more about renewable energy and renewable energy targets than any other group in the country, and it would be a pity if there wasn't some contact by the group doing the review and the authority staff. But do you want to mention what you're doing on electricity?
To possibly clear up some confusion, there had been reports that we were starting our own RET review. We're not. We are doing just a research study on the electricity industry. You may have noticed the government's green paper on the emissions reduction fund talked about figuring out what to do, how the electricity sector would fit into that arrangements, figuring that out later, and figuring out, in conjunction with the RET review. And so this study is really just looking at some options. Well, if there is a blank canvas for the treatment of the electricity sector, what are some options? We can get those modelled, put that in the public domain, and promote a public discussion about options. So that's all that is. It's not actually a RET review.
Could I just mention something? I mean, most of the focus is on electricity, but transport's another big sector which hasn't been covered. The report does have some suggestions there, and in my view, there's significant low-hanging fruit that lies outside this very fraught debate about RET and carbon prices, simply by following the lead of the US and Europe in terms of fuel efficiency standards. So we've had reports suggesting that we could improve fuel efficiency over decades, over a lengthy period of setting the standards and turning over the fleet, but by as much as 50%, with big savings to consumers. The cost of the more fuel-efficient vehicles would be offset quite rapidly by a declining fuel consumption, particularly if oil prices continue to rise.
Can I just take you further on that? The graph on page 166 is really illustrative of where Australia sits in the world, which is quite horrifying on fuel standards.
Yeah.
It's very, very far below. So I'm trying to understand, given what's happened to our car industry, are the cars that we're importing from places like Japan, Korea, Europe, are the emission standards for those cars, do they match those countries or do they match ours, which means that they're more polluting, and therefore if we tackled those emission standards, would it actually have virtually no impact on what's left of our car industry?
I do, yeah. Well, that's certainly my understanding, that we're getting cars from countries that wouldn't meet the fleet emission standards of those countries. Well, I think we're getting a mix of vehicles. It's partly a matter of vehicle mix, but certainly what we're seeing is that they can manufacture to standards that are less stringent than what we would have here. And of course, a lot of that was driven by the perception that we had this big car industry producing V6 and V8 fleet cars that would have great difficulty in meeting the emission standards. So whatever the merits of that argument, obviously it's academic in the pejorative sense now that the remaining domestic manufacturers have announced they'll be pulling out. Clearly we're talking about imposing standards on imported vehicles comparable to those in the home markets of those countries rather than accepting a lower standard.
So that could have virtually very little, what kind of economic impact?
Well, obviously none of the kinds of impacts that critics of the other policies have said. That is, there won't be a domestic industry to be affected. There will be, those cars are somewhat more expensive to make, but that will be offset for consumers by the lower cost of fuel. So it's certainly a direct action option that could be addressed, that is open without, I guess, opening these issues of prices and things that have become so politically fraught. So it is something which we could do now, follow the Europeans and the US with a bit of a time lag, and by the time the standards were fully implemented and the fleet was turned over, the estimate is as much as a 50% reduction.
As you say in the report, the government's direct action policy is still very much under development, but we know that bare bones of it, the emissions reduction fund, baselines, etc. In your collective expert opinion, if access to international permits is not granted under the direct action policy, does Australia have any hope of achieving a 19% target, let alone the 5% target by 2020?
I think we really have to wait until we've got more details on the direct action plan. We don't have any collective view of the direct action plan and its implications at this time.
Just to follow up further on that, though, if the 5% target was to remain until 2020, where are we tracking in terms of reaching that now? I mean, how close are we to that? Will we be able to achieve that quite easily? And if so, what is the government spending more than $3 billion trying to achieve if we're going to hit 5% target without doing anything?
Well, some people think it will be achieved easily, but as I said before, we're not at or near minus 5% at the moment. We're above, our emissions now are above the 2000 level benchmark, so there's ground to be made up. But Anthea, are you looking at this?
The projection, and it's a projection, so with all of the caveats that you normally put on modelling projections, the projection that we have is that with the current renewable energy target in place and with all of the energy efficiency standards and all of that sort of thing, but we haven't made any assumptions about the direct action plan or with no carbon price, then our estimate is that emissions would be 17% above 2000 level emissions by 2020. So you'd have to get from 17% plus down to minus 5. So in terms of being on track, no, that's, you need a policy to get you to -5, because left to its own devices, the economy would not. That's not what the economy would produce.
I talked a lot about the report being driven by the climate science, and as a non-scientist, I indicated in what the climate science means in a shorthand way to me, but we've got two prominent scientists with us who are members of the authority, and I wondered whether David and Ian would like just to say a few words about the climate science as such that underpins so much of our thinking about this whole thing.
Well, I'll make a general statement, David, and you can fill in all the gaps that I'm about to leave. So for me, one of the things that I've obviously become aware of over recent time is how closely scrutinised everything is when it comes out talking about climate change and the science behind climate change. So in my experience, it would be one of the most heavily scrutinised area of science that I've ever experienced. And what you have to say is that the overwhelming bulk of it has stood the test of that scrutiny. The consequences of that are that I find a lot of the science compelling. I think that, and I as a scientist would always put in the caveat that we deal with probabilities and the like, so I'm not actually going to say that there is absolute proof of this or that, but I am going to say that it's pretty compelling. I've seen arguments about, whether the temperature of the atmosphere is in pause or declined since 1998 or whenever. I have in front of me a graph showing the change in the ocean heat content since 1960, and it's just going inexorably up. I mean, the point is that not all of the heat that's generated stays in the atmosphere. 90-odd% of it is absorbed by the oceans. We're seeing changes to the ocean. We have seen changes to the temperature. If you don't believe it, then you've got to impugn the messenger. You've got to say it's groupthink, some stupid expression like groupthink. You've got to be able to say that something is flawed about it. Now, scientists are human beings, and sometimes they'll make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are picked up, and when they're turned into a position where it would appear to absolutely deny the main thesis, then it seems to me that we have to recognise what's going on here. And I think what's going on is that there has been no reputable science through the scientific process and the scientific method that disputes the main theses in this area. And as I said, it's been so closely scrutinised, pored over by experts and non-experts alike, pored over by professionals and amateurs, pored over by everybody, and the main thing goes on. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have put in 2 trillion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere, and how can that have no effect? We can have a bit of an argy over what the final impact might be. We know that half of that stays in the atmosphere and the other half is absorbed by the oceans and the land. But we know that it's there, we know that it's a greenhouse gas, we know that we're putting it into the atmosphere, we know that it's human activity that's putting it into the atmosphere, so it would be really silly to say that it has no effect, or as some people say, a delusion. That would be silly. The point is that what we've got to get down to is to work out what the impact will be and what is the cost of doing something, but really importantly, what is the actual cost of doing nothing? And they have to be balanced off, and we have to find out of all that a way forward that means we're simply not sloughing off to the coming generations changes that would be unachievable simply because we're unprepared to do something today that is not unreasonable. And to have that debate in a civilised way would be refreshing.
Thank you, Ian. David?
Let me just follow on with a couple of aspects, and in particular the government and the opposition have pointed out that they accept the science and that the best agencies for reporting on that science, the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO and the universities in Australia, and in particular next week the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO will be releasing their State of the Climate 2014 report, which basically strengthens the conclusion that are in our report that talk about ongoing warming of the climate system, ongoing increases in greenhouse gases, ongoing increases in heat content of the ocean, as Professor Chubb talked about, as well as increases in hot extremes, increases in extreme fire weather and fire danger, and projected further increases in high temperature extremes and heat waves, in further increases in extreme fire danger, further increases in heavy rainfall events. All of those will have major impacts. The other part of the science, and I think Professor Chubb didn't really talk about it, but it's an underpinning aspect of the approach that's been used in our report, is to take what we call a carbon budget approach. And that is, the science is now demonstrating clearly that it is the cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases, of long-lived greenhouse gases from human activity, emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, that determine the changes in global temperature. That's not the emissions at 1 year, it's the cumulative emissions over history. And that means that we can look at what is a reasonable share for Australia of the cumulative emissions that are consistent with warming of less than 2 degrees. And remember that the governments around the world agreed to limit greenhouse gas emissions to avoid dangerous climate change. And avoiding dangerous climate change has been agreed to be limiting warming to less than 2 degrees. The authority has decided that we will seek or use a 2/3 probability of staying below 2 degrees of global warming. That gives 1.7 trillion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and other greenhouse gases over the period from 2013 to 2050. 1.7 trillion is a really big number. But the Australian share of that ends up being about 1%, and that leads to a 10.1 billion tonne budget for Australia, and that can then be apportioned if we only have 5% emission reductions by 2020. It leaves a much larger requirement for rapid emission reductions over the subsequent period before that emission budget is used up.
Thanks, folks. We're going to have to wrap it up there.
Yes, let me just thank you again for coming along. I know there's been a bit of competition to get your attention today, but thank you for coming along. And the numbers that David mentioned, and scientists like numbers and they have to work with numbers, all those numbers which are important are within the report if you wanted to go back and check them out. But thank you for coming. Bye.